Okay. So I told some of you guys this already, but I planned for a couple weeks to do this talk, and I was researching a lot, but then like a couple days ago I had to scrap everything. And so what I'll be delivering today is something that's more fresh, but it's pretty big, so it has to be split into different sessions. So today we're not going to have quite the satisfying crunch, but it's going to be satisfying if you stick around for the rest. I basically want to share a condensed summary of our whole Western philosophical tradition in a way that's relevant to why we have so many issues in a deep, like, existential sense. And in order to do that, I'm gonna have to condense a lot of history into a short amount of time. But before we do that, I want to start with a story from my ancestral lineage, from the Tagalog people in the Philippines. So, in our story, we have three beings before every animal, every human existed. We have Bathala Maykapal, which means like noble creator. We have Ulilang Kalaluwa, who is like a serpent that flies in the clouds in the skies. And then we have Galang Kalaluwa, which is like a winged being that travels through the cosmos. So we got Bathala, he lives on the land. We got Ulilang, he's a snake in the sky. We got Galang, and he's a winged god. And these three gods don't know each other exist, and they're lonely, and they're all in their own realms, never knowing that anything else exists other than them. And Bathala, he wants some companions, he wants some subjects, he wants to create creatures, but there's nothing around to feed them. And so he's like, okay, I'm not gonna create any more beings, there's no food. So years pass, and then Ulilang, the serpent, comes down to a hill that he likes to hang out from in the sky. And below, to his surprise, he sees this being, Bathala, sitting down there below him. And he's shocked. He doesn't know that another being exists. And so he just stays there and he stares for a while. And then after a while he asks Bathala, "Who are you?" And Bathala looks up and he's just as surprised. And he says, "I'm the ruler of the universe. Who are you?" And Ulilang says, "I'm the ruler of the universe. Let's settle this shit. Let's throw down." And so they got into a fight that lasts 3 days and 3 nights. And in the end, Bathala, the being of the land, ends up vanquishing the serpent. And instead of giving him a proper burial, he burns Ulilang and he sprinkles his ashes in this barren spot. Now, what we have here is a champion, right? Bathala has killed this rival, and at the same time, he is utterly alone. And so he spends another eternity in this state until finally Galang Kalaluwa happens to wander upon the land. And instead of treating him with aggression, he immediately welcomes Galang. And he says, "Oh, come stay with me. You can live on the land. I want to hear your stories. I'm sure you have a lot of stories from your travels." And out of this hospitality, a great friendship grows. And the two of them end up living on the land for ages until finally Galang is growing sick. And Galang basically says, "You know, old friend, I can't repay the joy you've given me, but I remember how much you wanted companionship. So do this as my final request. Take my body and bury it amongst the ashes of Ulilang, your rival. And upon his death, Bathala follows his instructions. He takes the winged god's body, he buries it, and later, out of the combination of the ashes of the rival and of the body of his greatest friend, comes an interesting plant growing out of the ground. It has the body of the serpent of Ulilang, and it has at the top of the plant the wings of his beloved friend. It's the coconut tree. And it has these strange fruits, and he comes and he picks the fruit and he husks it, and he sees in the coconut the face of his beloved friend. And from that creation, the people now have a source of housing, of materials. They have a source of food. They have a source of water. They have rope and textiles. They have everything they need, and so we can create the first beings, the first humans. So that's an interesting creation myth, because there's such a drastic switch and difference between coming from being alone to coming into immediate rivalry, and then coming into being alone and coming into deep companionship. And I was like trying to wrap my mind around like, what is this myth trying to point to? And I could only really understand it with this experience I had when I was marching, doing a 50-mile march with some friends and some people of the community. And this was around mile 35. We had gone around and we were in Oakland, and we were in a cafe doing a bathroom break. And as I walked into the cafe, there was a sort of like pride, right? It's like, this is the most I've ever walked in my life, and there's a pride in that I had walked 35 miles. And so there was this thought train from that pride that was like, oh, these people don't know what I've done to get here, right? They don't know that I've walked 35 miles. And there's like a sort of status, right? There's a sort of like distance between me and everyone else in my perspective. And even though it gives you a sense of pride, it's also a discomfort, because there's a space that's irreconcilable in my reality, right? But then there's another thought train that came, and it said, no, I do not know what they have gone through to get to this point. I do not know the march that they have taken, the 1,000,000-mile march of their life, every single individual, to come to this moment in time in this cafe where we can all be here for this brief period of the journey. And from that realization, that switch out of this egocentric bias, right? This seeing of my perspective over everyone else's, that distance was closed in the sense that, now I can actually like explore out of wonder, right? Because now there's the difference is not in like kind. The difference is in the content of their journey. And even though I can't really know what that is, now there's an opportunity to explore that together. And that experience made me realize that I think that's what the myth for me is pointing towards. It's this cognitive bias, the egocentric bias. By the way that our minds work, we have certain ways that we filter information, right? Because there's too much information in the world, and so our minds have to have certain biases. And one of those that's like a core bias that a lot of other ones come through is that we prioritize our own perspective over other people's perspective, right? And this is like a source of other ones, like the confirmation bias, which is that we tend to look for information which basically agrees with what we believe in and with what we know. But so the egocentric bias is just as useful as it is destructive, right? Because if you're being chased by a bear and you're really considering the perspectives of everyone, including the bear, and the bear's about to chomp down on you, and you're like, you know what, I'm not going to fight because like the bear is just as important in perspective than I am. Like, no, we're not going to be able to survive that way. And so the egocentric bias is basically putting our perspective above the bear, right? And that's what enables us to fight and enables us to basically like survive in those moments of conflict where you have to like rise above. But obviously, beyond these situations where we're actually in danger, the egocentric bias creates more conflict, right? Like, because we place our perspective over others inherently, there's a difference, like in that coffee shop. There's a creation of status. There's that instinct for conflict that comes through and gets created for more violence and more conflict. And so in the myth, he says, "Who are you?" And he says, "I am the ruler of the universe." He's basically saying, I am the center of the universe, right? And in contrast to Ulilang, he says to Galang, "Come with me, I want to hear your story." And so like the asking of like the coming out of wonder that, oh, this person has like a perspective, has their stories that is more than I can know, is this this beautiful thing that we as humans have to get us out of the egocentric bias and to get us like into recognizing, okay, I can be in tune and on the same level with the beings around me. And not only does it change how we like perceive ourselves in the world, but how we participate in the world, right? Because, like in the coffee shop example, like when the world is darkened in that way, you become a different person. But I want to tune into how is it that we're able to become participants in the first place. And I want to kind of share some results of these experiments that these researchers Metzlaff and Moore did with a bunch of infants and babies that basically have some interesting results about human nature. So this team basically found that as soon as 40 minutes after birth, babies will mimic with near perfection the facial movements that you do to them, right? You can look at pictures of this. You'll stick out your tongue and the baby will stick out their tongue. You'll scrunch your face, the baby will scrunch their face. And that's like as soon as 40 minutes. So it's like, it's this universal, like inherent ability that we have as humans. And in this, it's not just that they're like mimicking an idea of the behavior, but they actually would even like activate the muscles in the right order too. Like the person would stick out their tongue and the baby would like stick out their tongue. They would move their tongue before they would like move their lips. It's like, I don't know how they would measure that, but apparently that's what happened. And so there's this inherent like connectedness between the baby and with the person that they're imitating, right? So what's more, they did this thing where they have a weird object like a cylindrical lamp, and they have someone come up with a baby and touch their forehead against the lamp, and the lamp lights up, right? And then a week later, they present the lamp to the baby, and the baby touches it with his forehead. So not only can it mimic just like a mirror, but mimic across time. They also found that it seems as if these small humans also can internalize not just behaviors, but intentions. And the way that they inference this is that they had this experiment with like a toy dumbbell where you can basically like take off the dumbbell, right, from the rod. And so the researcher would be like, oh, he pretend to struggle, and then he'll slip. And then he'll give it to the baby, and then the baby will take it off, right? And then he'll present it to the researcher, or she. And not to be sexist, sorry. And then they would glue the dumbbell onto the rod, and then the baby would try, and then they would get frustrated, and then they will beckon to another adult and try to like hand them the dumbbell. So not only did they didn't just mimic like the slipping of the dumbbell, but they actually seemed to inference the intention that the person had. Now this is very interesting. And this universal ability to kind of internalize behaviors and perceived intentions seems to be the basis from which we can learn language and learn basically how to become people, right? Because we can internalize the way that people move, but also in the way that we think they desire, in the way that we think they intend to do things. And on a macro scale, in terms of like human development, it seems like this process is like quite crucial for babies, because they don't know, like, conceptually, okay, I am hungry, I need milk from my mother's breast. They don't know I am cold, I need a blanket for insulation, made of these fibers. Like, they don't know how to satiate their metabolic needs. And so they experience this discomfort, right? This suffering, this lack in their body, whether that's hunger or coldness, and they cry out, and a caretaker comes and tries to guess what is going on with this baby, and then the caretaker will try to supply milk or a blanket, and through that process of the person showing that parental love, the baby can learn what this feeling means. It can learn what hunger is. It can learn how to satiate the hunger. It can learn how to satiate its coldness, right? So there's this process of internalizing someone who has more agency than you in order to gain more agency, in order to satiate your needs, in order to quell your discomforts. And it seems like this is the same process that we carry on through the rest of our life. This process of experiencing discomfort, not knowing really how to satiate it, looking to others who seem to have more agency to figure out how I can satiate it, and then to just kind of try. And I mean, just to give an example of what I'm thinking, like, I remember reading this story where this guy was saying, after high school, I wanted to go and get a liberal education, right? I wanted to go to this city and get a liberal education, and so I moved out from my hometown and went to college. And then later on, in hindsight, he realizes, wait, I didn't even know what a liberal education was. Really? I just wanted to get away from my parents, right? He experienced discomfort, and then he's like, okay, well, this seems like a way to quell the discomfort, and then he just shot for it. And then he says, okay, well, then all of a sudden he wanted to get a nice job in this certain field. And the reason he told himself is, well, because, I care about making new things and innovation. And then in hindsight, he realizes, I didn't care about making new things and innovation. I didn't even know what that meant. Really, I was just not wanting to be in financial insecurity. And this seemed like the thing that people were like pointing towards as like the obvious thing. Okay, there's the discomfort, the financial insecurity, there's the potential like way to satiate it. And then he's like, it goes on and on and on, right? We don't always know what it is that we hunger for, and we can chase things that can satiate them in some way, but we can also get trapped in this cycle of chasing things that do not fulfill, that do not nourish the soul. And that's the issue with desires beyond our metabolic needs, right? Like, after we figure out, okay, what hunger is, like what warmth is, like there's a whole other world of desires that we can learn, and things that are beckoning for us to buy them, right? Like promising that they'll satiate us in some way. And we don't necessarily like know, but we continue to chase. Like, you know, people want to get married, but they've never been married before. How do you know you want to get married? Right? There's this distance between what you want and what you actually know is desirable. So this is an inherent like gap in knowing and in desire. So I propose that the chasing that we see in our world, the endless consumerism, the unquenching of the thirst, the deep existential thirst that we have, has roots in the tradition of our whole civilization, and that if we can understand those roots and how we've gotten to today, we can better understand that hunger, that emptiness that people are so desperately trying to fill, that feeling that's so hard to communicate, that we don't quite know how to satiate, could be better understood and so more wisely fulfilled if we understand the lineage of how we think, of why we are doing this world, like why we're doing this version of civilization. And one person who I think has articulated this hunger really well is this professor from Toronto, John Vervaeke. He has dubbed this hunger the meaning crisis. And I'm going to try to condense a lot of what I've learned from him in a very short period. So buckle up. So at certain points in human history in different parts of the world, there's a shift from a single world mythology into a dual world mythology. What does this mean? It means that at certain points in civilizations, people see things as there's just one world, right? We all know this agreed upon world. To get higher in your sense of self is to just get more powerful in this world. Think of the oldest version of ancient Egypt, right? In order to become the most, like, the wisdom was about being the best in battle and being the best, most glorious, shining, like, beautiful person in the world that you could be. And then at a certain point, places shift into a two-world mythology. Think in India, like the everyday world of illusion, Maya, and then the more real world, Brahman, right? The ultimate reality. Think in for the Israelite tradition, you have like the everyday world, and then you have the promised land. Think in the Greek tradition, you have, well, let's say Plato, you have like the everyday world, and then you have like the world of the eidos, or like the world of forms, the world of ideas. And so in this worldview, the way to become a more wise person is to be able to transcend the everyday world and to get insight into the more real world. Oh, and also in China, this is like the everyday world, and then there's like the Tao, right? So this takes place in different places all over the world, and it's theorized that maybe why this happened is because there's this common current of shamanism all around the world, which is basically people undertaking practices of altering their consciousness. And you find in different shamanic traditions like a sense of leaving the body, right? And getting insight into the nature of reality, which would help your people. And if people all over the world are doing some form of having altered experiences, then it makes sense that people are starting to think, maybe there's a more real world than this everyday world, right? And this is directly influencing the Greek philosophical tradition, which is crucial for the Western world, in the sense that during a certain era, the Greek city-states opened trade with across the Black Sea. And so all these nomads from like the Tibetan areas, the Asiatic areas, those shamans were able to contact people in Greece, and so they imported a lot of shamanic like ideas into what would become the Greek philosophical tradition. And so this is someone like Pythagoras, who is almost like this like semi-divine figure, who like kind of was like this cult leader, like music man, who like basically told people, if we get together in community and we commit ourselves to transcending this illusory world, we can become, you know, more real and more light, you know, something along those lines. So he influenced Plato in that self-transcendence kind of model. Socrates also influenced Plato. Socrates was a guy who basically was like, you guys are not realizing that the way that you understand is not matching up with the way you're acting. And so he would try to get people to realize that they are acting going against their better conscience, even though that they know that really buying this thing in the marketplace isn't going to make me happy. He would make them realize through a process of questioning them, so like, what are you doing today? Oh, you're buying things? Oh, well, why are you buying things? Oh, you know what happiness is? Define it for me. And so he would make people realize, oh, I know that that's not going to make me happy, and yet I'm buying it anyway, right? That influenced Plato. And Plato basically ended up creating like the Western tradition's like first psychology, in a sense. And this was the psychology through which every way that we think about soul like descends from, even though we don't remember it. And that's the man in the head. And this is ancient Athens, so he called it the man in the head, the lion in the chest, and the monster in the belly and in the genitals, right? And so this is like appetite, this is reason, and this is something that we don't fully have a word for in English, the thymos, right? The reason is about like truth. The appetite is about like, you know, hungering for just like needs and like things that give you more agency or power. And then the thymos is about honor. It's about that thing that connects us to other people. And what he saw was that, sorry, I'm gonna backtrack real quick. Socrates, he would question people, and then he got killed by the government. And then Plato really loved Socrates, and he's like, why did the greatest city in the world, the city I love the most, kill the man I love the most? And so he's like, well, people must be acting foolishly because they have inner conflict. And the inner conflict is because these different centers are not aligned. And these inner centers, these different desires are working against each other. Your appetite is working against your reason. It's working against the way that you perceive yourself with others. And so, you know, let's say, okay, I want to lose weight. I know it's healthy for me because I don't want to get heart disease. That's what the man says in the head. But then you see that chocolate cake and the appetite says, yummy, yummy, yummy. And then that wins every time over the head. Because he was saying, look, the monster is always going to win over the head. No matter what. It's more powerful. What we can do is teach the man. We can train the lion, which is about honor and about relationship, in order to together tame the monster. And then when you have this connection between the different centers, they can march in lockstep more towards like what you really want and what you truly know. And this is why, you know, people who successfully take actions for their health do it in a fitness community or in a wellness community, right? You use the head to tune into the chest, right? Into the honor, into the way that we relate to people in order to tame the monster. And what that process is of quelling our inner conflict was for Plato inherently tied to seeing deeper into reality. So Plato had this idea that I'll basically tell you a parable that he had. It's called, Plato's cave. You have a bunch of people who are shackled at the bottom of a cave. They're sitting on chairs. They're facing a back wall. This is all that they've known in their whole life is the shadows of these objects behind them and like echoes of people, right? And so all that they know are the shadows and the echoes. And then one person is able to break free, and he's able to look up, and it's so bright, he's never seen fire before, the true source of the shadows. And he's like, if he realizes, oh, this is more real than this. And he sees the people that were making the sounds. And then he's like, oh, wait, there's like something else higher up in the cave. There's more light. And so he starts walking towards that. And it's bright, but he has to, his eyes have to adjust, and then so he can keep progressing up the cave until he gets to the top, and he's like at the surface world. And he sees the open sky and the sun, which is the true source of all the light, right? And so this character is like, oh my gosh, this is what's most real, it's so beautiful. And so he runs back down, stumbles back down the cave because his eyes are not used to the darkness anymore, and he makes a fool of himself to the people at the bottom of the cave. And because he's not acclimated to their reality anymore, they see him as a fool, even though he knows what's most real. And if they weren't shackled, maybe they would try to kill him, like Socrates. And so this is how he saw Socrates. He saw him as someone who had seen deeply into reality and tried to come and share it in a certain way with people, but that they could not stand the truth, and that so out of their foolishness they killed him. And so this process of seeing more of reality and then being able to step into more reality was for Plato the process of training, teaching the man in order to align the inner conflict, in order to have the inner peace, to basically take another step towards seeing deeper into reality. And then so it's like this process where your inner integration and your integration with the reality comes lockstep together. So this is the term anagoge, like the ascent of out of the cave. And this story is basically told a bunch of times. I'll touch on it later. So this idea of the sun was for Plato called the eidos. And these are paradigms or patterns of reality that are the most real form of all the illusory stuff down here, right? So there's that two-world mythology. So for example, E equals mc squared is like the sun, through which everything is just a form of this perfect, timeless principle. So that's Plato. And then he has a student who is very influential to the way we think, and that's Aristotle. And Aristotle's like, okay, that's cool, but I love plants and I love animals and I like studying them, and your thing of reality being this principle has nothing to do with growth. So then Aristotle's like, okay, how does this relate to growth, to development? And so he comes up with this interesting idea. He's like, it's too complicated to think about how plants grow. It's too complex. Let's think about how a chair is made out of a block of wood, right? It's taken from this thing. The carpenter has this sort of relationship with the wood, and then it turns into a chair. And so he comes up with the idea of potentiality and actuality, right? We think of potential as just something that's so basic, right? But at a certain point, this was oh, well, maybe this idea that things have potential. The wood has the potential of the chair, and the chair has the actuality of the wood, right? So as it moves out of potentiality into the realness, into the actuality of the chair, it becomes more of what it's supposed to be, right? It becomes more actualized. And so he didn't only see this as a process that everything is undertaking like in nature, but that we are undertaking as human beings. So he kind of developed this hierarchy of being that we participate in. So like at the base level, there's like rocks, right? There's like things that they're not living. Then there's living things like plants that grow. And then there's self-moving things like animals that grow but also like move through space, right? And then there's more into actuality, mental things. Think dogs, right? Like mental things that are perceiving and that are acting. And then there's deliberate things on top of that. And to be a deliberate thing was to be able to reflect on the way that you are thinking, to be able to intentionally like adjust the way you're thinking, to step into more wisdom, to correct our self-deception. And that was the process of coming into more wisdom, of coming out of potentiality into actuality. And so he gave this very clear purpose to people of, you are meant to ascend through this level, through this hierarchy, to become the most human you can be. Like that's what your purpose as a human being is. And the way to become a deliberate thing, as well as all those other things, is to cultivate virtue. And what are virtues? For Aristotle, there's this idea of the golden mean. So think of two opposite traits like cowardice and impulsive brashness, right? The golden mean between cowardice and impulsive brashness is courage. And so he's like, okay, you can find the sweet spot between these extremes, and there you can find virtue. There you can find qualities of excellence. And when we develop those qualities of excellence, then we can grow in more wisdom, we can become more of a deliberate being, and we can actualize ourselves. So look at how in this framework, in this point in history through his worldview, you have purpose, you have spirituality, you have a version of science where to make yourself more real is to come more deeply into seeing reality. So like the best science, you have the best sacredness conjoined together. At this point in history, there's no separation between the two. And so he's like, okay, another point. What is it? What is it to know? What does it mean to really know something? It's not just to describe something, right? If you ask an architect and a person next to a building, hey, can you describe that building? And the architect built that building, they could maybe describe it the same exact way, right? But the architect really knows the building more. How? Because the architect has the blueprint in his mind. He has the structural organization of the building, the functional organization of it. It has the pattern of it that exists in the building. He shares that pattern in his mind. And so, for the carpenter, the way that the carpenter knows the chair better than someone who sits in it is that there's a deep sameness, right? There's a sameness between the object and between the mind. There's a connection between the two. And that is what it means to know something for Aristotle. And this way of seeing of how we know things, like we still do the expressions of this way of knowing. Like, okay, I'll just use an example that John Vervaeke uses. Tom is drunk at a party. Later, his friend says, "Dude, I heard Sarah likes you." And then he's like, what? No. And then he's like, you're drunk. And then he asks this other person who was there. He's like, oh yeah, I heard her say that, right? John was there too, you should ask him. He asks John, and then John's like, yeah, she said that, or something, right? And he's sober. So we do this process of like, okay, if enough people agree that their mind, that something happened, right? You perceived it, then I can know that she likes me. I can know if our instruments for understanding reality are working well, that our perceptions are accurate, right? We still like work based on that understanding. Okay, so that is a understanding that will slowly get broken apart through the lineage of the Western tradition, that will basically lead us to think through that worldview, but at the same time think against that worldview and like self-negate our own thought process. So I'm going to jump out of the ancient Greek tradition and jump into the ancient Israelite tradition, because these two lineages kind of like converge in a character that I'll talk about at the end. So the ancient Israelites, basically, they had an innovation with their God. Instead of their God just being like a god of one thing, a god of the harvest that's tied to this location, they're like, our God is beyond all time and space. And the name of God, which is like YHWH, could be translated as I am that I am, or it could be translated as I will be what I will be. And their God was a God of the open future, right? Of the potential promised land, of being outside of time and space and inserting himself in time and space to affect humanity in order to change the course of history, right? This was their God. And so this process of the course of history was very, very important, right? They had this weird way of talking about knowing that's very different from the way that we know now, right? When they'd say knowing in the Old Testament, they would say like knowing to mean sex, right? They'd be like, and then John knew Sarah, and they're meaning like then John had sex with Sarah. It's like, this is weird, right? We don't use knowing in this way that, oh, like to have like sex with. But there's actually a lot of, at the root of a lot of languages, this is what knowing is tied to, is it's tied to sex. So this is interesting. The way that they perceived knowing was more akin to that of Aristotle, where there's a deep, not like Aristotle, but in a way that there's an interpenetration of the thing that you're knowing and you. Like, to know something is to like interpenetrate each other in an existential way, right? It's like to participate in the thing in the deepest kind of way is to truly know it. And so that was the Hebrew word da'at. Da'at was like to know something. And so this was what they saw as the basis of their faith. That there's this course that their God is leading through history, and that you, to know God, to have da'at, and to then have faith, is to be interpenetrating with God, right? To be in the course that God is like laying out for you. And when we walk off the path, when we stray from the path that God is laying out, then they perceive that as sin, right? The way we think of sin is just like immorality, but like in the oldest sense, it's about like falling out of that deep knowing, like falling out of that interpenetration with the path. So I'm going to go forward to talk about this guy who's pretty important to our world, as it is, and that's this figure Jesus. Jesus was alive during the time of the Roman Empire. I'm going to do something very something I never thought I'd do, which is try to explain Jesus. And I'm no Christian, but I'm going to try to give what I feel is the essence. See, Jesus' core message, the way I understand it, is that our God, our Jewish God, is agape. And sorry, I have to rewind. In the New Testament, which is what the Gospels that are talking about Jesus are written in, they're written in Greek. And the words that they use for love, that people read love in the Bible, really it's 3 different words, but we just combine them all into one. If you watched my second talk, you should know these. The first one is eros, and that's loving something because it nourishes you. So that could be like erotic, like romantic, sexual, but it also could be like food, like loving a cookie because erotically, because it nourishes you. There's philia, which is loving something because you are nourishing each other, because there's companionship and fellowship, and that's what's supposed to be at the root of philia sophia, is fellowship, love of wisdom, so philia sophia. And then there's agape, which is loving something because you are nourishing it, and that's like a creative parental love, right? Like the caretaker loves the baby not because it deserves it, not because it's earned it, not because there's a mutual sharing of respect and resources. It's not even a person. You love it because you're nourishing it, and so you are enacting this creative love that turns this sludge into a person, right? That's agape. And so Jesus is saying, look, God is agape. God is this this parental love. And not only is God agape, but what he's demanding is not sacrifices that you pay the church to go get a lamb and slaughter it. What he's demanding is that we show that agape towards each other. And this is such a profound pivot in the history of the Western tradition, because he's talking to people that have no status in the Roman Empire, right? They're not citizens, they're slaves, they're women, they're children, they're people who do not live up to the standards of the empire that has taken them over. And he's telling them, look, there's a home for you in the way that you relate to each other. If we treat each other agapically, if we see each other as a baby, as a child, as the potential that we can nourish into a greater actualization, then we can come to know agape more. We can come to know God more. We can come to know love more. And this is what the teachings about forgiveness are, right? To forgive is to give without just being having earned it, right? You forgive the baby because it has not earned it, and you just want to nourish it, and so you continue your relationship with the baby, right? So this is why Jesus is the Son of God, why we are the children of God. It's this, he's trying to share this parental love with people. And what does that do? That forces people to shift out of the egocentric bias that we have. Because when you are taking care of a baby, you're no longer the top priority. You're no longer your perspective isn't the only important thing. And so this culture that he created, in which he was creating communities where people were treating each other more in this way, enabled them to get out of their egocentric bias, to find more peace, to find a home amidst this Roman Empire, which would ultimately last much long after the Roman Empire. And I was actually going to share a practice that it's so simple and it's so profound at the same time. It's basically just the practice of telling other people when they do something good, being thankful to them when they do something that we like, like, oh, I really like the way that you did that, thank you. It's such a simple thing, but that is like when they train like animals to be able to do all these like crazy tricks, like to train a rat to go up a ladder and then do a spin and then come back down. You have to pay attention to the rat, and every time it does something that you like, you give it a treat, right? And it's like, not to manipulate each other, but to see that I can actually give to each other. We can give to each other in a way that we are actually like feeding each other treats to come more into actuality out of our potentiality, and to like let people know that the goodness in them is desirable and that the goodness in them is good, and then I see that and I'm grateful for that. So I want to make that more of a practice in my life, and I feel like that's a very basic way that we can practice agape. So after Jesus dies, there's this Jewish and Roman man named Saul. And Saul, he's basically like a part of the Roman government. He's dealing with like the law and justice, and he's persecuting Christians. He actually attended the first stoning, the first martyrdom of a Christian, where they stoned this guy Stephen, and he held everyone's coats as they stoned this guy. Okay, so he's very involved in persecuting Christians, which at the time were not called Christians, but followers of the way. But anyway, that aside, he has this mystical experience where he's walking down a road, and then he's blinded by this flash of light, and then he has this voice, and he's like, "Oh, who are you?" And the voice says, "I am Jesus who you persecute." Right? And so he's freaked out. And so he goes to Antioch, where a community of Christians live, and they know who he is and he knows who they are, and he asks them to take them in. And they do the agapic thing. They forgive him even though they know he's persecuting them, and they take him in, and they spend time sort of like rehabilitating, right? And so he becomes a part of the Christian community, and then he leaves to the desert to have like some time away, and he has a mystical experience. He feels that he is more in union with God, right? That he like knows God more. And so he comes back and he says, "I am a changed man. I am no longer Saul, I am Paul." And so he becomes involved in the church in a very prestigious way, and he's writing letters, and those letters would basically become the books that are now called the New Testament in the Bible. And so here's an interesting passage that I'm sure everyone has heard in some form, but I feel like we've heard it with the wrong ears. And so I'm going to just share it with you probably as you've heard it, and then I want to share it with you with the knowledge that we've gained from before. So here's a beautiful piece of poetry that he wrote in a letter to some Corinthians. "And yet I will show you the most excellent way." This is Paul. "If I speak in the tongues of men or of angels but do not have love, I'm only a resounding gong or a clanging cymbal. If I have the gift of prophecy and can fathom all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have a faith that can move mountains but do not have love, I am nothing. If I give all I possess to the poor and give over my body to the flames that I may boast, but do not have love, I gain nothing. Love is patient, love is kind. It does not envy, it does not boast, It is not proud. It does not dishonor others. It is not self-seeking. It is not easily angered. It keeps no record of wrongs. Love does not delight in evil, but rejoices with the truth. It always protects, always trusts, always hopes, always perseveres. Love never fails. But where there are prophets, they will cease. Prophecies, they will cease. Where there are tongues, they will be stilled. Where there is knowledge, it will pass away. For we know in part, and we prophesy in part, but when completeness comes, what is in part disappears. When I was a child, I talked like a child, I thought like a child, I reasoned like a child. When I became a man, I put the way of childhood behind me. For now we see only a reflection as in a mirror, then we shall see face to face. Now I know in part, then I shall know fully, even as I am fully known. And now these three remain, faith, hope, and love, but the greatest of these is love. So we've all heard that probably at a wedding or something, and that played at my parents' wedding. And people use this about romantic relationships, but obviously that kind of love fails all the time. It says love never fails, and yet 50% of marriages fail, right? It's saying about all these traits about love. And so we've gotten so lost in our romantic bullshit that we forget the love that they're talking about. They're not talking about eros, they're talking about agape. And so when you read it with agape, with loving something because you're nourishing it, because you are parentively, creatively nourishing it out of potentiality into actuality, it reads more as follows. And yet I will show you the most excellent way. If I speak in the tongue of men or of angels, but do not have agape, I am only a resounding gong or a clanging cymbal. If I have the gift of prophecy and can fathom all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have a faith that can move mountains, but do not have agape, I am nothing. If I give all that I possess to the poor, and give over my body to the flames that I may boast, but do not have agape, I gain nothing. Agape is patient. Agape is kind. It does not envy. It does not boast. It is not proud. It does not dishonor others. It is not self-seeking. It is not easily angered. It keeps no record of wrongs. Agape does not delight in evil, but rejoices with the truth. It always protects, always trusts, always hopes, always perseveres. Agape never fails. But where there are prophecies, they will cease. Where there are tongues, they will be stilled. Where there is knowledge, it will pass away. For we know in part, and we prophesy in part, but when completeness comes, what is in part disappears. When I was a child, I talked like a child, I thought like a child, I reasoned like a child. But when I became a man, I put the way of childhood behind me. For now we see only a reflection as in a mirror, then we shall see face to face. Now I know in part, then I shall know fully, even as I am fully known. And now these three remain, faith, hope, and agape, but the greatest of these is agape. This is the essence of the Christian love that Jesus was trying to teach, right? And yet you look around and this seems to be missing. This seems to be missing within the world, but also within Christianity. And a part of it, of that process of losing it, as we'll soon see, is a process of the path that the religion of Christianity will take through its philosophical tradition. So, I just want to touch on one thing about Paul. He gave this, he wrote these letters and impacted the world, but he also impacted the world in another way. See, he had deep inner conflict. He was Jewish and he was Roman. He has this old self, Saul, who cares about Roman law and justice. And at the same time, he's Paul, the Christian, the agapic lover, right? And so he has this old me and this new me that are coexisting in myself. And he says, you know, he feels that he's like becoming one with God, but he does something that we do in relationships. We project onto the other. And he projects his inner conflict onto God and says, just as I have a part of me that inherently wants justice and inherently wants love, so too does God have the quality of demanding justice and of demanding agape and of demanding love. And so then he solidified this narrative that God basically was the one who sacrificed his son in order to fulfill the justice aspect. And so he basically solidifies this self-conflictual like seed that would soon spread into the rest of the tradition, into the rest of Christianity, that we would inherit as a cultural attitude of self-negation. And so while he, gave this establishment of the church in this beautiful way, he planted a seed that would end up destroying a lot of the beauty of it. So I'm going to take a step out of the ancient Israelite tradition and go into the Greek tradition again with a guy much later after Plato and Aristotle by the name of Plotinus. Now Plotinus wanted to take Aristotle's worldview, right, all this stuff that we talked about, the way of knowing, the ascent, he wanted to tie it with Plato's anagoge, with his cave, his spirituality. And he wanted to tie that with the Stoics' therapeutic project. Right? I didn't talk about Stoics today, but if I were to sum up in one sentence, Stoics are basically like, you can't control everything, you gotta control what you can control. And so if we can better do that, we can deal with the world better. And so he wanted to unite all of these different aspects into this core spirituality. And that would become what's called now Neoplatonism. So he combined all those things, and he wondered, okay, so we have this way of knowing, we have this ascent, what makes things more real? And he realized what makes the chair more real than just the wood, more actualized, what makes bodies more real than the shadows, what makes this shared experience more real than a dream is that it's more integrated, right? The dreams are not quite integrated. They're choppy. They don't have a continuation through time. The body is more integrated than the shadow. And so the things that are real are more integrated in this dynamic way. They're more one. And so he thought, well, that's interesting. There must be this common principle of how things are real. And he called that principle of how things are integrated to-en, the one. And this is such a deep part of how we actually think that we don't realize. Think of the movie Matrix, right? The Matrix has Plato's cave. You have the world of every day, the Matrix, and then you have one who awakens, right, who's called the One, and he ascends out of the cave, and then he comes back down into the lower reality and attempts to free people. And and also his name is Neo, which comes from Neoplatonism, by the way. And so from this integration, we would have a basis that would influence the next big character, which will be the last character in the epic that I'll talk about today, Augustine. So this is where the Greek tradition and the Jewish Israelite tradition conjoin in this guy Augustine. Augustine was alive around 400 to 500, so right as the Roman Empire is declining. And so he he wasn't always a Christian. What Augustine would end up doing is merging Christianity, the Neoplatonism that I just described of Plotinus, that merges those things together. He would merge Christianity, Neoplatonism, and Gnosticism, which is like that deep way of knowing with God. Now I'll give some background. Augustine ends up writing the first autobiography in the Western world called Confessions. And this is how we know what we know about Augustine. And basically we find out that he was a sex addict. He himself had a lot of inner conflict. And he remembers a story of when he was younger, when he was an adolescent, that really was traumatic for him. In this event, he was with some friends, and they break into a courtyard and they steal some fruit. And that's it. But he's like, the crazy thing is, I didn't steal the fruit because I wanted to impress my friends. I didn't steal the fruit because I was hungry. I simply stole the fruit because it was the wrong thing to do. And he feels that there's this inherent darkness in him. And so he's allured to the mythology and the religion of Manichaeism, which is coming from Mani, the Persian prophet. And their mythology is kind of like Star Wars. You know, there's the light side and there's the dark side, and you want to ascend to the light side out of the shadow side. And then later on, he ends up traveling around the Mediterranean. He ends up teaching rhetoric, so he can speak, he can write. And he comes across the writing of Plotinus, of Neoplatonism. And as he's reading Plotinus, he has this mystical experience where he experiences the ascent towards the one, pt.1, that Plotinus is talking about. He has this mystical experience where everything feels integrated, right? Everything is one. And then, just as quickly as it happens, it gets stripped away. He feels as though, because of his inner darkness, he cannot hold into this beautiful experience of divinity. And it's devastating. It's like, I touched paradise, and then I'm locked in a cell, right? It's even worse than if I was just locked in the cell, because I know what it's like to touch divinity. And so he's depressed, and he goes and he stays at his mom's house, Monica. And Monica is a Christian. And she has an early version of the Bible, you know, the letters of Paul, in her bookshelf. And he's staying there depressed, and then he's sitting there, he's looking at the bookshelf, and then he hears a kid outside say go on, pick it up and read it. And then so he picks up this book and he reads Paul. And he likely read the passage that I read to you earlier. And he realizes something. What Plato is talking about, this process of integrating the thing, he's pointing to two different loves. There's this inherent love for an inner integratedness, and there's a love with being integrated with reality. And he realizes, the reason why I have so much darkness, the reason why I'm a sex addict, is not because I do not have good enough reason. It's because I don't have good enough love. And so Augustine basically says, well, this is where Christianity comes in. Because if I can actually grow in love through agape, through the Christian love, then I can undertake the Platonic ascent towards more unity. And so he's what Plato needs is it needs Christianity. And so he unites the agape of Christianity, the narrative of Christianity, with the ascent of into more realness of Plato, and also with Aristotle's levels of being. But he adds this interesting twist where he says, this move from potentiality and chaos towards actuality, that's good and evil. Evil is this dark hole that sucks everything into chaos, into potentiality, and good is this thing that brings things into more integratedness. And so at this point, after his writings would become like the basis of a new culture, there is an inherent basis in the structure of reality for good and evil. It wasn't just about like, oh, I think something's wrong or I think something's immoral. There was this this structural aspect of good and evil, of chaos and of integratedness. And he's doing this as the Roman Empire is collapsing. He's literally in the city of Hippo as like there's people raiding the city, like raiding the bridge. And from him unifying all of these other aspects of like the culture, that unified teaching would become the basic home, the psychological home for the people in the medieval age that was to follow. And I'm not going to be able to talk about that just yet. But I want to point out something about what that worldview afforded for people. You see, you had the narrative of Christianity, and the ascent of being gave people a very clear purpose, right? The way of understanding that Aristotle had provided had given people a very clear coherence to how the world works. The combination of those two, of how the world works and how we have this narrative, gave people a very clear understanding of the significance of their lives, right? And what you need to do in it. And so you have these three like axes. You have coherence, you have significance, and you have purpose. These three axes of meaning that would become the psychological home for people in the medieval age. Yeah, I already said that. But that aspect of meaning is what has been stripped away in the age to follow. And so, because we cannot rely on the same exact ways that they had gotten their meaning, we have to go back and take what we can from these traditions and leave behind what no longer works. Because in the end, what I'm trying to point to is that there are these perennial problems, right? Just like the egocentric bias. There are inherent ways in the way our minds work which make it so that there are, throughout all of humanity, there's these problems we have to deal with. And these traditions afforded people ways of dealing with it, right? Whether it was through this agape culture, whether it was through Plato's like vision of the self. And when we lose the livability, the feasibility of those traditions, then we no longer have a way to deal with the problem that still exists. In this case, the egocentric bias. And so, what we can do is take what we know works for dealing with a perennial problem like egocentric bias and just practice it without a dogma, without a doctrine for now, just based on like rebuilding the axes of meaning that we have lost in our culture. And so I guess the practice that I want to share today is something related to like the gratitude thing. And it's basically I was reading some studies, and they found that when people do an effective gratitude practice, and this is not just writing down things that you are grateful for, this is listening to stories that invoke gratitude into you, like reading stories or hearing stories that sheer impact, that people's physical performance increased, people's sense of well-being increased. Amongst women with breast cancer, their inflammatory cytokines went down, which means less recurrence of potential recurrence of breast cancer. So this is something that we're meant to be doing, which is what we've been always doing as humans, which is sharing impactful stories. And so I want to invite you guys to, in this next period of practice, think of a story in which someone really impacted you. Something that invoked a deep gratitude in you. And from that place, we can share it with each other. So that's all I have now for the talk. We'll complete it another time. But that's the foundation of our Western tradition, right? That's the foundation. And it hasn't fully broken apart at this point yet in the story, but it's going to get there. So thank you so much for listening. Thank you for your time and attention. That's all.